Hello and welcome to my podcast, Our Backyard History. I'm your host Bryce and I'll be starting my podcast on our local history and hopefully with more to come. I'm extremely eager to talk about a piece of history seldom examined in history textbooks anyplace. For our first episode, we will be talking about German POW camps and labor camps in northwestern Ontario, Canada. I will be discussing this topic with John Lavoie, who is a wise man for history in our local areas, as well as the man who volunteers for the Manitouwadge Archival and Historical Society Museum. John, thank you very much for taking the time to discuss this topic.
You're quite welcome. I love talking about this.
I believe that such a topic is a great way to start this podcast. I feel like a good way to educate listeners on our history would be to discuss a less mainstream event during the Second World War. Mr. Lavoie, would you be interested in sharing to our listeners some information about this interesting, obscure event?
So sure, I'd be like to talk about what has become part of our local history, I guess. Although there was no Manitouwadge here during the Second World War, Manitouwadge didn't become a community until almost a decade after the close of World War II. But there were some spin-offs from the Second World War that gave our area some pretty interesting history affiliated with the Second World War. So during the Second World War, which was 1939, 1945, Germany was at war with England and Canada, and they eventually started to accumulate quite a few prisoner of wars from their various campaigns, a lot of them from the North Africa campaign, and these prisoners, also from the ships that were sunk, and also submarines, and the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe. So these prisoners, they were all housed in England, and England was starting to get worried about what if Germany actually manages to invade England. All these prisoners are going to be released and they're going to be a big asset to Germany. So they asked Canada if Canada would take some of these prisoners and house them for the duration of the war. So Canada did agree to do that, and they eventually, over a number of years, they took 40,000 German POWs and housed them on Canadian soil. There were actually 26 major camps set up right from one side of Canada right over to the other. And some of these camps are, you may have heard some of the names there, but there was one in Red Rock, which is fairly close to Thunder Bay. Monteith, which is over in the Kapuskasing-Cochrane area. There were several really large camps in Alberta. Naze, which is now a provincial park along the north shore of Lake Superior. There was some in southern Ontario. Kingston was one in southern Ontario. And of course there was Angler, which is my favorite topic to talk about because it's fairly close to where I live here in Manitouwadge. And there's just some incredible stories that came out of Angler during that, from the POW experience there. So, starting early in 1941, prisoners started arriving at these camps, and most of these camps were located in really remote areas. You got to recall back at that time in 1941, along the north shore of Lake Superior, there were no roads. There was no highways. The only access was railroad, the CPR, and by water, by Lake Superior. And most of the prisoners, they had no idea where they were at all when they were shipped to these camps. On the train rides in, the windows were blanked out, so they couldn't really try and figure out where they were. And even if they did escape, I mean, how would they get away? It was 250 miles to the lakehead, which was the closest, pretty much the closest town, almost the same distance to Sault Ste. Marie. So, and then the bush, I mean, it was wilderness. I mean, truly wilderness then. There was no roads or anything like that. So you can imagine the black flies in the summertime, springtime would be just terrible. They didn't have those black flies over in Germany, so they had no experience with those. So a lot of disincentive to try to escape, for sure. So I talked a little bit specifically about Angler, because I don't know if I mentioned there was about over 500 prisoners eventually ended up in Angler, and they were guarded by what was known as the Veteran Guard of Canada, which was made up mostly of World War II veterans. And but the camps themselves, they were pretty well run by the prisoners themselves. The guards, for the most part, spent their time outside the barbed wire, making sure nobody escaped. But inside the barbed wire, the prisoners had their own tailors, their own cooks, their own post office. They had a little store, a commissary. Some of these camps had their own orchestra. There was sports, well-organized sports. Physical fitness was a big thing with the Germans, so they did a lot of sports, orchestras, and they were free to pursue hobbies and even take correspondence courses. So it was quite. It was certainly a better experience than being out in active war. They were provided with lots of food, lots of quality food, and the Red Cross actually visited. Red Cross was neutral, of course. They visited and make sure the camps were running well, that none of the prisoners were being abused, and the prisoners could actually receive care packages back from Germany or back from friends in the States, German friends in the States. They could actually get care packages from time to time. So it wasn't that bad a life at all. They weren't forced to do any work. Like I said, they kept busy pretty much on their own. Inside that barbed wire, actually I'll explain the compound itself. The compound, which was several hundred meters on each side, was enclosed by barbed wire fence, which was about 12 feet high. And actually two barbed wire fences, about 6 or 8 feet apart. So a double barbed wire fence. And the fence was made up of barbed wire, horizontally strung barbed wire, spaced about 6-inch intervals, so nobody could crawl through it. And then inside those two barbed wire fences, closer towards the center of the compound, was another short fence about 3 feet high. And it was understood by prisoners that if you tried to cross that first little 3-foot fence, the guards had legitimate reason to actually fire on you, to try and prevent you from escaping. So not much opportunity for escape. The fence itself had guard towers on each corner. The rectangular shaped compound had guard towers on each corner, and at least one guard tower on each side along the length of the fence. And then inside the barbed wire, there was a large central square where sports or other activities could be taken, parade grounds where they'd meet for roll call 3 times a day also. So, and inside there was 10 bunkhouses or dormitories, and there was also a hospital run by the prisoners, post office that they ran themselves. I think I mentioned a store, their own little store, and even a small jail, just in case some prisoners did something that required them to do some jail time there. So, not a lot of opportunities to escape, like I said.
Very informative stuff, John. Based on the research that I've also gathered on this topic, not everyone was happy about their situations at the camp. In 1941, 2 German Luftwaffe pilots were part of an elaborate escape plan to get out of the Angler POW camp. What got me interested was that, despite the harsh terrain, from the troubles of Lake Superior to the endless forests full of bears, how did these 2 manage to make it across to nearly the Pacific coast? Indeed, even the police that have delved into the whole situation were a bit skeptical by the possibility that these people that they were investigating were 2 Luftwaffe pilots, especially if you were a German in the north.
So yeah, I mentioned how well supplied they were within the compound. In fact, one of the POWs in an interview that he gave after the war, he actually said that they had so much bacon, they were supplied with so much bacon that they actually burned it in the stoves to aid with the heating or for warming water. That's how well supplied they were. And they were actually allowed outside of the compound once in a while if a group could go out, as long as they had a guard or guards with them, pick blueberries, or there was always a daily walk up to meet the train. The train stopped, I guess it was about 15-20 minute walk from the actual compound, because they'd go to pick up the mail and supplies from the train every day. So a group of them would be given permission to go with the guards out to meet the train. In fact, one of the interviews that was given by one of the former POWs after the war, he was on one of these group trips out to meet the train. So they were walking along, and he says a moose stepped out on the road in front of them. This was Paul Mengelberg, who came back and actually worked in Long Lac after he was repatriated to Germany. He came back and worked in the logging industry there. But he says the old veteran guard, he upped with his rifle, going to shoot the moose, fresh meat, of course. And the prisoners realized that he was never going to hit that moose. His gun was waving all over the place. So the guard handed his rifle to one of the POWs, and the POW shot the moose. So this is just an example of how well they got along with the guards and stuff. So anyway, right after the prisoners started arriving there in January of 1941, they started planning immediately started planning a mass escape. Very well planned, and they planned to actually execute this escape on April 20th, which is Hitler's birthday. So this was going to be a birthday present to the Fuhrer. And so they started, as soon as they got into the camp, within a few days they were actually already tunneling. They figured that was the way to get out, pretty well the only sure way to get out. And so they worked almost 3 months on this tunnel and kept it secret from the guards. Just amazing that they were able to keep it secret for that length of time. So part of the plans for the escape, they started preparing packs. There was planning on about 100 had agreed that they would take part in the escape. So they started preparing pack sacks full of necessities that they would need after they had escaped the compound. So they'd have their food, they'd actually have a set of civilian clothes, and lots of food to tide them over during their escape period. And actually had maps and compass. They'd managed to steal a map from one of the guards' offices for a short period of time, long enough for them to make copies of it somehow and provide each of the pack sacks there with maps. So they were well prepared. They weren't going into this blind. Now the tunnel itself, this is quite an engineering feat, because the Angler compound is built on a big sandy plain. Sand just like similar to beach sand. You can imagine that's not particularly easy to tunnel through, because it would cave in very easily. So once they realized they were going to need support framing inside the tunnel, they started pillaging lumber from the bottom of the dormitories. Remember, there was 10 big dormitory buildings, and they were well constructed, I guess, because they were able to steal enough lumber off the bottom of these buildings out of sight to actually frame the entire tunnel in enough wooden support to keep it from caving in. The tunnel itself was about 4 or 6 feet under the surface of the ground, and it wasn't perfectly flat. It would dip here and there, I guess, probably to not sure why, maybe to reflect the ground surface above them or something. But so the tunnel was 150 feet long. That's what was required. And what it would do, it would join most of the bunkhouses and then extend out right underneath the double barbed wire fence and break out into a very small gully just outside of the barbed wire fence. So that was the plan, 150 feet, and they worked on that. Now, they had no real tunneling tools. You realize they certainly weren't supplied with shovels or anything. So they were using improvised things. They were using water pails. They were using coal scoops. I don't know if little coal scoops are a tiny little shovel, a metal shovel about 2 feet long for feeding coal into a coal burning stove. They had large forks from the kitchen that they stole. There was, and of course, the tunnel was very cramped. It was only just tall enough to crawl down or sit on your bum in while you worked. So it wasn't terribly big. And as the tunnel progressed, they actually had oxygen problems because of the lack of oxygen. So some of the workers were actually passing out. So they had to develop a ventilation system, which they made out of discarded metal cans joined together, and with a fan at one end to force the air into the working face of the tunnel there. So the gully itself wasn't a very deep gully, and I've been there. I've actually seen it. It's probably only 5 or 6 feet deeper than the surrounding terrain. So, and it was very, very close to one of the guard towers where they were going to break out. So they had to be careful. Inside the tunnel, they built a little wooden railroad for moving the sand from the face to underneath the access to the tunnel, which came up in several of the bunkhouses. And this sand that they were excavating, it was all scattered underneath these 10 bunkhouses. It was spread out under the bunkhouses, and that's how they got rid of it. They couldn't pile it outside anywhere where it was going to be obvious. And because sometimes the tunneling would make a lot of noise, or the salvaging the lumber from the bottom of the bunkers would make a lot of noise, they'd made arrangements with the camp band, the camp orchestra, to muffle the sound, do their practices while a lot of this sound was going on. And of course, they'd always have lookouts posted, watching for the possibility of any guards checking on them or anything that might give them away. So they had signal systems set up by stomping on the floor. Certain stomps or certain words, shouted words or something, would signal to the tunnelers to time to stay quiet because it was dangerous. So they worked on this, let's say, almost 3 months, and they finally got just to the point where they were ready to break out into the gully. And the date was just about right. They were only a few days away from Hitler's birthday, which was the April 20th. And however, there was a glitch in the plans, of course. What happened, and it's still common today, they got a spring storm along the north shore of Lake Superior. They actually had quite a lot of rain and melt, And the compound, of course, there was snow covered inside it still at that time. But the outline of the tunnel actually started to show through the snow. And they were really worried about this. They were afraid that the guards were going to notice this showing on the surface. So there was considerable discussion about whether they should stick with the April 20th deadline for moving out, for escaping, or whether they should step it up a few days. The actual tunnel actually started to flood with water from all the rain. So they finally made a decision. They had to go now or never. So a couple days, I guess it was April 18th, a couple days before their planned escape, they set it into motion. And so I'll talk about that in a minute.
Yet again, a very interesting segment. So, while the escape was without a doubt a very elaborate plan which involved taking lots of calculated risks to achieve, escaping the camp was without a doubt the easier part. However, the hardest part was what to do after they escaped. What plans were on their minds for the aftermath of the escape?
So, because of the storm, that spring storm, the decision had to be made to start the escape on a couple days before Hitler's birthday, so April 18th rather than April 20th. But even before they actually got out of the tunnel, they had been planning for months about, well, what are we going to do after we escape? I mean, maybe the easiest part was actually doing the tunnel and getting out of the tunnel. But remember now, they're in a very remote area. Some of them didn't even really know where they were, the geography of the area. So they had to come up with plans. What do we do after we get out of that tunnel? So usually they divided themselves into small groups. Maybe some of the groups were as small as just a couple, or maybe some of the groups were larger. And I'll just explain some of the plans that some of the groups came up with to do after they actually got out of the tunnel. So a couple of the guys had actually managed to construct a kayak out of stuff they had pilfered. Kayak, it was about, I think it was a 12-foot kayak made out of linoleum tablecloths from the dining room, and held together with wax and various stuff. God only knows how they did that, but they had actually managed to construct this kayak and hide it near the breakout point of the tunnel so they could have easy access to it once they broke out. And these guys were actually planning on paddling across Lake Superior to the States, because the States was still neutral at this time, and so they could find, there was lots of German people living in the States. They could finally get some help in the States probably to further their escape. One group was actually planning to row along the shore of Lake Superior down to Sault Ste. Marie, with stealing a rowboat that they had apparently seen somewhere. Another group was planning to canoe down to Sault Ste. Marie. They on the train ride in a few months earlier, they had noticed some canoes stored along the shore of Lake Superior, someplace where the railroad came close to Lake Superior shore. So they had actually whittled some paddles that they were going to use when they stole this canoe to actually paddle down to Sault Ste. Marie. Now, when you're at Sault Ste. Marie, the States is just across the river. So again, you would be able to get into neutral. Their plan was to get into neutral territory. Some of the prisoners, the Luftwaffe prisoners, the German Air Force prisoners, had actually seen planes, amphibious planes that were landing over to the west of Angler. Not sure what those planes were about, but they hoped to steal some of this plane and fly to freedom. Another group planned to actually walk through the bush to the other railroad track, which was the CNR, which ran quite a ways north of Lake Superior. That's the line that comes through Hornpain, Hillsport, Karamat, and up to Long Lac. So they planned to walk through the bush and hop that CNR train and get to someplace. However, the most daring one were this couple of guys who figured all of these other escape plans. They were the guards and the authorities would be able to anticipate what these guys were going to do, and they could be caught very easily. But there's two guys, Grund and Liebig, who were Luftwaffe pilots. They decided the best thing to do is head for Japan. Well, now, how do you head for Japan from Angler? And their plan was basically to hop the CPR train, which passed right by Angler, within a few hundred meters of Angler. They were going to hop this train and move west, just keep moving west, try to get out to the port of Vancouver. And because Canada wasn't at war with Japan at the time, Japanese ships were still landing in BC, and Japan was an ally of Germany, so they figured if they can get out to Vancouver, they can get onto a Japanese boat and make their way to Japan and eventually to freedom in Germany. So I'll just tell you how their particular plan worked. They did get out of the tunnel. Well, actually, I'll talk first about actually getting out of the tunnel. So we've already established that the decision to go on April 18th was put into place. They broke the tunnel through and got out to surface. However, I guess the escape force had been whittled down from more than 100 originally, and there was only actually 23 that actually made it out through that tunnel. And what happened is they all lined up in the tunnel. And remember, the tunnel had quite a bit of standing water in it from the rain there. So some of them were in pretty bad shape in the tunnel because they had to wait a couple hours in the tunnel. It took them longer to do that little final breakthrough of a few feet into the gully than they had anticipated. So a lot of them were hypothermic from being wet from the water in the tunnel, or they were passing out from lack of oxygen, or just the strain of that they were going through at the time. So they finally broke out, finally broke the tunnel through, and guys started bailing out of the tunnel. However, what happened, they had planned beforehand that when they break through the tunnel, they've got to take care of all those tools, the pails, the wash basins, the stuff they had used for tunneling. They've got to get that away from the tunnel so guys wouldn't trip over it coming out. However, they had left some of that stuff at the entrance to the tunnel, and some of the guys going out happened to trip over that stuff, and you can imagine the racket it made, any tin stuff hitting against other tin stuff made. So it alerted the guard in the tower, which wasn't very far away, and he raised the alarm. They got the searchlights on, they saw the guys escaping, he raised the alarm. So the alarm had gone out, and only 23 guys made it out of the tunnel. Not sure how many there actually were in the tunnel, but 23 actually made it out. And they started putting all of those groups or groups of 2 or more started putting their escape plans into effect there. So Liebig and Grund, they had been monitoring the train schedule for weeks ahead of time because these were the guys they were going to jump the train to Vancouver. So they knew the time the train was to be expected. They knew that the train slowed down. Any westbound train slowed down on its way towards Angler and past Angler because there was a grade there which slowed the train down. And once the train is slowed down, then it's obvious going to be a lot easier to hop. So they were successful in getting out to the railroad track. The train arrived on schedule. They managed to hop the train, And as the train was, and they got on top of some of the boxcars, as the train was passing the camp, they noticed all the lights on and all the activity there, that the search had already started, but they managed to escape. So they continued on the train, going westbound on the train, and as the train progressed, they went across they hopped across the top of the cars to try to find a boxcar or something they could get into. Eventually, they found a car with some sliding doors on the top, and they were able to get in through these doors. But what they had got themselves into was an ice car. At that time, blocks of ice were cut in the wintertime from lakes and stuff and frozen, kept frozen over the summer to provide refrigeration in the summertime. So it was pretty cold in that car. Also, before they got into that car, they had gone through a tunnel. There was, I think, 3 tunnels along that section of the North Shore, and they really had to. They came very close to getting wiped off the top of those cars. They really had to flatten themselves onto those cars to escape being hurt in the tunnel. But they survived that, and and even though the trains were searched occasionally, because certainly the searchers would anticipate that maybe some people would hop the train, they'd be searching the train, but they managed to stay undetected. And they changed trains a few times over the next few days. Apparently there was a lot of hobos, tramps around at that time too. Remember, they were just past the Great Depression, where a lot of people were on the road, a lot of unemployed people, a lot of beggars and stuff. Hobos actually helped them. They gave them hints about how to travel, where to find possibly find help and good drinking water and that sort of thing. So that worked out for them. They spent some time in Winnipeg, actually detrained in Winnipeg, and tried to find someone friendly towards the Germans, but were not too successful there. I think they did manage to scrounge a meal. And they continued that way all the way across Canada. Eventually got to Medicine Hat in Alberta, which is, now that's 1,200 miles from Angler. And this is about 6 or 7 days later, after they got out of the tunnel. And so they got off the train, and they were looking for help there in Medicine Hat, and they were discovered by Mounties and were rounded up. The Mounties did not realize that these were escaped prisoners, were escaped POWs, until the POWs actually told them, yeah, we're escapees from Angler. And then they were finally believed. So they were caught, and it's amazing, they were actually treated as celebrities in Medicine Hat. Celebrities, heroes. They gave interviews to different media outlets. They signed autographs. It was quite amazing, the reception they got there. But of course, they were returned to Angler. They got back to Angler, and the POW commandment, the Veteran Guard commandment, actually congratulated them on their escape, but told them then, but I've got to give you 28 days in jail. So they were put into the jail, and they were actually welcomed also by the POWs who hadn't escaped. The orchestra gave them a great reception there. So quite remarkable. So that was the most amazing escape story, I guess. That took place over a period of 7 days. Now most of the escapees were rounded up within about 48 hours. They just, because they had escaped into a spring storm, the weather conditions were absolutely terrible. The snow in the bush was knee deep or deeper. You can imagine trying to walk through that area, especially in areas that you didn't know where you were. So they were spread out all directions from Angler. Eventually, a group of these POWs were discovered in either a trapper's camp or an old abandoned log barn that was left over from the days when the make work project for clearing the highway had been taking place there. So the veteran guards, a group of veteran guards, found 5 POWs in a barn, and this was at nighttime, so it was dark. Visibility was very bad. So the guards called for the POWs to come out, show themselves, and the guards thought, or at least one guard thought, that the POWs were actually trying to attack them. So he opened fire, and 2 of the POWs were killed, and 1 was badly wounded, but managed to survive. So the 2 wounded, or the two that died, were Alfred Meethling and Herbert Loffelmeyer, and they were actually buried in the graveyard at Angler. So after 48 hours, pretty much all of them had escaped. There was one group that actually managed to escape for about 6 or 7 days, managed to stay on the loose for 6 or 7 days, but they had a terrible time there. They were staying out overnight, no real shelters, wet all the time, cold, and they eventually were caught by Mounties. They had got into a boxcar at Heron Bay, which was maybe Heron Bay would be maybe 12 or 15 miles southeast of Angler. And so those were the last ones that were rounded up. And so that was basically the end of that escape. But what's interesting is although Angler is so well known by history buffs, POW history buffs, Angler housed German POWs only for about a year and a half. So by the end of 1942, early 1943, all the POWs had been moved out, and Angler now became an internment camp for Japanese civilians, Canadian Japanese civilians who were moved inland from the west coast, and they spent the rest of the war period at Angler. There have been many books written about the first-person accounts of the Angler experience by both Germans and the Japanese. Very interesting reads. Many of those German POWs, because they felt they were treated so well in Canada, in fact, many of them commented in interviews after the war that if they hadn't been captured and housed as POWs, they never would have survived the war. So when the war was over, many of the German POWs asked to be allowed to stay in Canada. However, the rules of war, I guess Geneva Convention, required them all to be repatriated to Germany. They couldn't just stay in Canada. So first most of them were repatriated first they were sent back first to England to do work to clean up some of the mess that they had made, and then eventually they were repatriated to Germany. And then a lot of them, over the years, made application to come back to Canada and were granted that permission. There were literally, I think, thousands of them actually returned to Canada and settled in Canada and led a very good life.
Now, for a little bit of geographical trivia in regards to this topic, we're going to go back to the POW camps themselves. In the encompassing regions around what would later become Manitouwadge and Marathon, as well as Heron Bay, there existed an old logging area. Off the west turn of what is now today referred to as the 614, there is a landmark known to locals as the Amory Rapids, which is part of the Black River system. Manitouwadge Lake is the source for these waters, and it flows into the Pic River near Heron Bay, which in turn goes to Lake Superior. This area was first discovered by a geologist who was given work in this area. But during the war, there were foundations near the rapids. This is evidenced by clearings around the rapids. Today, this is a peaceful gem hidden in the Canadian Shield, and it was once an area where German POWs were sent temporarily during their more long-term stay at Angler to do logging work as well as doing the work of lumberjacks. They performed these actions to make up for the labor shortage in Canada during the war. Now, do you have any trivia in regards to the Angler POW camp, geographical areas, as well as maybe even evidence of the camp for that matter?
So, today, many decades later, if you go looking for the former Angler POW camp, you might be challenged to find the location. It took me 3 or 4 actual field trips down there before I actually located the camp. There seemed to be a lot of conflicting information about where the camp actually was. Quite a few accounts refer to it as being on the shore of Lake Superior. Well, it was not on the shore, it's actually a kilometer from the shore of Lake Superior. And other accounts have it going northwest, southeast, whatever, from certain landmarks, which were not accurate at all. But I did eventually locate the area of the camp, and once I actually found the camp and looked on Google Earth, then I could actually see the outline of where the former camp is. But it's very easily to pass over it unless you to pass over the image on Google Earth unless you actually know where the camp was. So there's little evidence there left of that could indicate that there was a camp there that actually housed hundreds of people at one time. It's been cleaned up pretty good. I believe most of it was cleaned up during the 60s and replanted to conifer trees. So this it's basically just a large flat area, and those trees that were planted are now up 30, 40 feet high. Most of them are jack pine, and quite often you can see straight rows which indicates that they were planted by hand. It's not just wild seeding. The most physical evidence you can still find there is the barbed wire. I guess the barbed wire basically was just buried very shallowly right at the location where the fences were. And during the decades, it's been overgrown with thick beds of moss, and which even doesn't really indicate from the surface that there's anything there. But if you walk over it, you can actually hear the wire, the rusted wire crunching down below. So that's a good indication that there's something there. So so it's basically just the barbed wire, and then quite a few of the accounts about Angler talk about the cemetery. And again, this took about, I think it was actually 4 or 5 field trips before I actually identified the location of the cemetery. It was, of course, outside of the compound, and various accounts had it going it's in directions or actually opposite of where I actually located it. But eventually there was I think there's six graves there. Several of them were German POWs. Some died of natural deaths, I guess, and there was at least two of the graves were Japanese internees later on. So all of the graves were eventually exhumed. The bodies were exhumed. All of the German POWs from Angler, and in fact all of the German POWs who died in Canada and were buried in various cemeteries throughout Canada, where eventually all these bodies were exhumed and planted to one location, which is near Kitchener, Ontario. So the cemetery at Angler, there's photos of it in its early days, interesting. And if you go there today, if you can find the spot there today, you'll actually see the depressions of where the graves were. That's the only indication. Trees that in the early photographs were just tiny seedlings are now up to 2 feet, 2 foot diameter on the base there. So it's the nature has really reclaimed the site. Manitowoc's Archival Historical Society does occasional field trips to the site and provides commentary on the POW experience and the Japanese internee experience there. So if you're ever interested on a tour, just get hold of the Manitowoc Archival Historical Society and Manitowoc Museum, and we can arrange a tour for you.
Well, John, that'll about wrap up this podcast. It was very nice meeting up with you and taking the time to discuss this topic, and I'm very sure that the listeners, as well as myself, have learned a lot from this podcast. And as John said, there are tours around the Angler POW camp area periodically throughout the year, mainly in the summer months, that John hosts and commentates as visitors travel throughout the once housed POW camp during the Second World War. If any locals, or for that matter, anybody who is residing in the Northwest has any interest in going on the tours, be sure to contact the Manitowoc Archival and Historical Museum. This was Our Backyard History, and have a good day.